Check, check. All right. What is going on, everyone? We are back with another 3 at 3. And yeah, you guessed it. There is no way we are talking about anything today except Libra. After months of speculation and just endless content and predictions, we actually have information about Facebook's Libra, which is of course their cryptocurrency blockchain currency thing. And so today, instead of doing 3 at 3 about 3 different topics, which is just hopeless because there's nobody talking about anything but this, we're going to look at 3 different aspects of Libra. So for those of you who don't know, just go start somewhere on their website and just read. So Libra was just announced this morning. The embargo was lifted. David Marcus, the head of the project at Facebook, wrote a bunch about it. There's a strong emphasis on kind of the global access to a shared currency. But of course, for a lot of folks, this is a Facebook project, or at least a Facebook initiated project. And the question that people are going to have is, are they going to be accountable, right? Facebook doesn't have the best record. Are they going to simply commingle our social data with our financial data, which could be a recipe for disaster? Well, we don't know is the short answer, but we do know a lot more than we did yesterday. And so the Libra Association is basically a Swiss foundation that's going to govern the currency. Facebook is a founding member, but it is not the only founding member. In fact, there's 27 founding members, and that could grow. Each of these founding members have agreed to run a node, a validator node, and they're putting in at least $10 million to the Libra investment token, which is different than the eventual Libra. It's the reserve fund that will be used to make the coin stable, or at least less volatile, but back it by real assets. It's going to be a huge number of different assets, including government bonds, including a bunch of low yield, low risk type assets. And so the interesting thing is there's a couple things with the governance that I think is worth noting. One is that there's a really strong idea of one entity, one vote. So you're only seeing you're only going to see those founding members get one vote for key issues. Second, there's going to be voting caps. So that same principle is going to turn into voting caps where even if people have over 1% of the total tokens, there's a 1% cap on the decision-making authority. And when people have more tokens than that 1% cap, that additional voting power will actually be distributed to what they call social impact partners or research partners who are mission aligned but who don't have the resources to invest $10 million. So the principle here very clearly, and kind of agree with it or not, or buy it or not, is a limitation of the power of Facebook to control the direction ultimately, or any one entity to control the direction. Now, there's a lot that could happen between now and then, but they're coming out with governance from the beginning, from the get-go, that is about limiting power. So that'll be interesting to watch. Next up, political response. Again, this is coming into a highly politicized, highly charged environment. Facebook is already the subject of huge scrutiny, antitrust rumblings. People are upset about them, with them for everything from data practices to basically you name it. So it's interesting to watch how a Facebook-initiated project is going to be received. So on the one hand, you have those folks who are excited, right? Obviously someone like Andrew Yang is pretty invested in kind of being known as an innovation candidate and being focused on what comes next and being pro that. Oh, crap, we missed the countdown. And then you have a lot of other folks who are a little less enthused, right? So almost immediately upon this coming out, you had rumblings from Europe that they were going to be, certain countries especially, were going to be very against this. So France came out very quickly, although it's the same French minister who's been against cryptocurrencies in general. So it's not particularly a surprise there. But I think that the important note is that we're dealing with a global economic force, right? A global phenomenon. We're talking about a U.S. domiciled company that's setting up a Swiss nonprofit to run a currency that doesn't exist or operate in any one jurisdiction or any one borders alone. So we're far from understanding exactly where the lines are going to be when it comes to how this thing plays out from a regulatory standpoint, from an approval standpoint. It's going to be really interesting to watch. Preston made the point, I think, here that there's one thing to be what the Libra project intends to be. There's another thing about how it's going to be when it comes to the actual regulatory regimes. So one thing that's notable is that Facebook is not requiring Libra users to have a Facebook identity. That's not true for Calibra, which is Facebook's proprietary wallet, but it is true for Libra in general. But the point that Preston is making is that once you make the decision to be a regulated, compliant project, you don't necessarily have all the control over what you are going to have to do. What you're going to have to actually do to comply. So, the interesting thing, though, too, is that there are a lot of folks who are recognizing that this is something interesting. The fact that Libra is domiciled outside the US, the fact that it chose intentionally not to be backed or pegged to the dollar, as so many other kind of stablecoin projects have done. The fact that the announcement, even, it seems small, but the announcement was made at 5 a.m. Eastern time, which is 5 p.m. China time, and which is kind of main time Europe, right? Like, crypto is a global movement that has much bigger implications than just the end of the U.S. borders, and this seems to suggest that. So the political response is, I think, just starting to come, but it's going to be really interesting to watch, and I think have a pretty outsized impact on how this whole thing shapes up. So with that, let's move on to the actual question of the hour, which I think is, who is the actual competition for Libra, right? For weeks, we have spent time talking about Libra versus Bitcoin and what the implications for Bitcoin are. When in fact, it seems like the competitive set for Libra might be actually different, right? So Melton made the point, banking no longer belongs to the bankers. There's a lot of folks who are looking at what Libra offers and even its expressed intention to provide financial services for those who don't have them, and see it as a competition for a bank. Others have noticed that very noticeably absent from the list of the initial validator set, the additional founding members of the Libra Association Council are banks. There are payment rail companies, there's Visa, there's MasterCard, there's PayPal, but there aren't actual banks in the traditional sense. This feels notable, right? So maybe the competition is banks. Tom, I think, makes a great point here that there is a whole set of this where Facebook, in addition to announcing Libra formally, also provided documentation for the smart contracting language move that's going to sit on top of it and allow developers to build on top of it. And it's really interesting. If you think about the number of developers there are versus the number of Solidity developers there are, or developers of any of the other smart contracting languages, it's hard not to see how a regulatory compliant, almost non-ideological, to the extent that you can call it that, smart contracting language on top of a financial primitive with the scale and reach of Facebook doesn't just attract a whole new set of users or developers rather, to this space. Now, to what extent Facebook actually intends, or Libra actually intends, to compete with other smart contracting languages, to what extent you see layer 2 solutions kind of building on-ramps for developers and tooling for developers to work within the Libra ecosystem, remains to be seen, but I think it's worth noting. And finally, you got to come to Andreas for the big perspective. While Facebook's Libra doesn't compete with any open, public, permissionless, borderless, neutral, censorship-resistant blockchains, it will compete against both retail banks and central banks. This is going to be fun to watch. This is the sentiment I've seen from a lot of Bitcoiners in particular, and I think is pretty true, that it always has kind of felt like the Libra versus Bitcoin idea was a media narrative more than an actual narrative, right? They just provide or kind of function in such different ways. Now, I think that what's for sure, however, and what they have in common is that both of these systems have inherent in them a redistribution of global power. And in Bitcoin, obviously, that is a total shift in the power of money away from states. Money is no longer just the providence of states. It is inherently less controllable, let's say, if not uncontrollable, as compared to other forms of money. Facebook's Libra is different, and I do think, though, that it has an undeniable shift of power, except that it may be that that power shift is not from states to everyone, from a distributed, decentralized network of actors, but from states to corporates, right? For the first time, these corporations are going to be able to print money en masse. And if it gets adopted, it will have really, really huge implications for the way that we think about nation state power. And so, that may not come to fruition. I don't think that necessarily Facebook is sitting here hoping that it turns into a nation. I think the interesting thing, though, is that when you're dealing with phenomenon of this scale and magnitude, it may not matter so much what Facebook intends for the project. The project may have implications of its own that are inevitable and forceful and create their own force in the market and their own force as a social and political inevitability that is uncontrollable. So it's going to be interesting to watch. There's no way to deny the hugeness of it. And we will be covering it probably all week. So look out for more on this on 3x3. I don't know what else will come up this week that we have to talk about. I'll certainly keep an eye out if there is anything. But until then, thanks for hanging out. I'm going to do a quick check to see if there are any questions, and then we will see you next time. All right, guys. Cheers.